Hey, folks, it is November the 10th, and we're beginning our new unit on World War II. You can find the notes, they've been posted in our Google Classroom. So make sure you check on that, read through them, keep up. We're going to have a vocabulary quiz posted in the Google Classroom on Friday that has all the terms from the prior units, including this one we're starting today. And as we move on, our other quizzes will be cumulative as well. And so, World War II, it was, after all, a world war. And uh, if you remember the First World War, many of the belligerents, the countries that were fighting in it, believed that that would be the last great war ever. Wow, true. So, um, hey, does anybody know who that guy is on the left talking to those troops? That's General Eisenhower. Otherwise, people knew him by his nickname, Ike. Eisenhower, like many American great generals who win a really big war for us, will go on to become president. This has happened time and time again in the past. And of course, Eisenhower will be one of those. He's going to win the war in Europe for the American side. And of course, later on, a couple of presidencies later, he'll be president of the United States. And he's talking to paratroopers in the 101st Airborne. And so, just like World War I, you're going to see a lot of innovations in warfare. Whereas often in World War I, we call it the war of technology. World War II is known as the war of science. And so scientific innovations such as radar, jets, missiles, parachuting, a lot of different things regarding secret codes like encryption. So a lot of things are going to come out of this war. So you need to know these dates. The Second World War spans from 1939 to 1945. And if you remember, 1939 is what we call the end of the Great Depression. So the end of the Great Depression and the beginning of World War II correspond with one another. All right, moving on. But as is our norm, we are going to have some vocab terms. So let's go ahead and see what those are. So remember, if you know what a term means and you like already know that definition in your heart, you don't have to write it down. It goes for all your notes. But make sure that you're careful. And you don't have to write down the entire definitions. I shorten these definitions down for your sake. So the first is totalitarianism, a form of government in which all aspects of daily life are controlled by a central authority. It's total. So everything, your thoughts, your faith, your family, every bit of that has some sort of control and regulation regarding it. Neutrality, a policy of non-involvement in which wars or the affairs in wars or the affairs of hostile nations. I'm sorry, I misread that. So essentially, you want to stay out of other people's business, especially when it has to do with warfare. Not so much with trade, but as far as sending in your youth to go fight and die for another country, a neutral power doesn't want to do that. Mobilization, the making ready of military forces for war. Remember, we talked about mobilization before World War I, when you had the Germans mobilized, Tsarist Russia mobilized, and when they sent their mobilized troops to their border, Germany attacked both the East and the West. Rationing, the limited private use of a commodity so that it may be distributed by a government. So things are going to be rationed quite a bit because this is going to be a total war. So things such as rubber and aluminum, steel, meat, fuel. They're going to limit its uses here in the United States so that more of it may be used for our troops and our allies during World War II. Genocide, the slaying of a group of people based on race, religion, or ethnicity. World War II is not going to be the birth of genocide, which is a Latin word, genus, like a tribe, and kide, to kill. So there have been other genocides before. Some have claimed that what Britain did to the Irish was a form of genocide. And we know definitely after World War One, there's going to be a massive genocide of Christians by the Turkish people, where the Armenians are going to be death marched off to by the millions. But we'll have to don't talk about that. All right, so casualties, the loss of forces in combat through either death or injury. So if you ever hear the news and they talk about casualties in some conflict, they're not necessarily talking about death. They're talking about people through injury rendered incapable of helping with a fight. So you gotta go to the hospital basically, or the morgue, one of the two. Are y'all ready to move on? Almost. All right. So, so once again, now we have more paratroopers. These, of course, are from the 82nd Airborne. So the military, militaries are split up into very big things. First, you have branches, right? You have Army, Marines, Navy. They didn't have the Air Force in World War II yet. They had the Navy had its fighter pilots and bombers, and the Army had its. And of course, I believe the Marines, I don't know if they had it now, but they'll definitely have their own afterwards. And from there, you break it up into corps, and then you have divisions, then you have brigades and battalions, companies, platoons, squads, and then the individual soldier. And so this is a division. So it's a very large unit. And this is during the war where you see massive use of paratroopers. Of course, paratroopers will be used again in other conflicts, such as in Grenada. Another one, like Panama, like Iraq, the invasion era of Iraq and Vietnam. But this is the one where you have massive amounts of troops. It's very, very dangerous work because often they missed their targets and got shot out of the air. That's like that. So here's that overview. You don't have to write this down. We're going to cover it throughout the unit. So in this period of American history, we will cover the economic recovery brought on by the wartime production. So back at home, this is going to be a lot of people are going to have jobs. There will be a lot of rationing. The economy will be rebuilt. We will also discuss how the bombing of Pearl Harbor precipitated the U.S. entry into the war on the side of the Allies. More so than World War I, this war would be a total war affecting those on the home front, as seen through the rationing of commodities. Though we won't see like massive amounts of combat here on U.S. soil. You can see France, Germany, Russia. During this war, Japanese, German, and Italian citizens were moved into internment camps. So here in the United States, like in World War I, a lot of people of German descent, we had their businesses vandalized, they get beat up or mistreated. But in World War II, the President Roosevelt will actually take people of Japanese, German, and Italian descent and put them essentially in internment camps. They weren't, like murdered, but they were still put in prison despite not committing crimes. The United States and the USSR, FDR Roosevelt. The United States and the USSR will emerge as the two competing superpowers due to the outcome of this conflict. And so this will lead to the Cold War, which we will definitely discuss. We're going to definitely discuss that after break, but I don't know if we're going to get through it before Christmas. Let's see. All right, so first we're going to talk about what led to all of this and what led to it. You have to look at different parts of the world. So first you have the East, which of course the main belligerent there for us was Japan. And in the West, we're later going to talk about Germany and Italy. And so the idea of nationalism is really going to start taking off. They say that nationalism is kind of like it was birthed from what we call the Romantic period. And the Romantic period isn't like have to do with like romance between a woman and a man. It has to do with is the idea that there's something non-scientific, almost emotional in how you carry yourself. And there's like an emotional, deep-rooted like fondness and love for your home country. So much so to where your devotion to your home country is an ideology that in many ways mimics a religious fervor. We call this nationalism. So in places like Japan and Germany and Italy, nationalism is going to be a huge thing. Nationalism had a lot to do with the birth of World War I, whereas one country wanted to beat up another, kind of like as a means of competition. Here, it's going to be mixed pseudoscience that we call race theories. And so you're going to have a mixture of racism with this as well, to where the idea of one race has the right to subdue another. And so Japan is mixed into this. The Japanese people are going to find that they're going to pull themselves up into the modern world essentially within one generation. They are competing with every modern military, industry, and education system throughout the world. They're top notch. And they view other Asians as being racially inferior. And this is going to help spur what we're going to see as what we call the Japanese Empire, where you're going to see the enslavement and exploitation of places such as China and Korea and other parts of Asia as well. So, global tensions. This is the build-up to the war. Following World War I, and due to the hardships of the Great Depression, the The United States went back to an isolationist foreign policy. We didn't want to deal with other parts of the world or worry about their conflicts because the depression was so bad here at home. Couldn't afford it. Well, what are you going to do about it? The depression, however, impacted the globe. Remember, it was a global depression. Not only was America losing out on jobs and money, so was most of the rest of the countries in the world as well. This led to many nations to take various emergency measures. During the 1930s, Japan was a fully modernized country, which relied on international trade for economic growth and for its food supply. So, there's not terribly too much fertile land in Japan, especially whenever it starts having a very high population. And that population is working in factories like an industrialized nation tends to do. And so they have to import grain like rice and things like that. So whenever they face a crisis, and another thing too, they have short supplies on other things as well, such as coal and oil. They have to import that stuff. And we're going to see that since they don't have that, they're going to start looking at other countries as a source for it. Nationalists there called for a Japanese empire across its neighboring region and looked to Manchuria as a step in that direction. Manchuria is in China. Manchuria was rich in iron, coal, and food, and it already made up 95% of Japan's overseas investment. Japanese business owners and investors had already had a lot of factories and mines and things like that they owned and operated in China. China during this time period, though it had an emperor, it was facing a lot of problems. It was extremely poor. Poverty has been a very bad problem for most Chinese people throughout all of their history. They have a very long history where most of their wealth is held in the hands of very few. Japan is going to see this, look down on them for this. They're going to see them as a backward society. China didn't even have very much of a functioning military. It was divided in sectors controlled by different European powers, including Japan and Russia. It was already being exploited. They had a rampant drug problem with opium. And China was already experiencing revolts by communists. So they were very organized. In September of 1931, a group of Japanese army officers came up with a plan to seize Manchuria for their own country. They did this without permission from their government. They decided to do so themselves. Because wherever you would have these businesses, they would have Japanese troops protect those businesses. You okay, Kenny? The most important part for this you need to understand is that Japan is expanding aggressively. They're taking over their neighbors' territories. So nobody's at war with them right now, but nobody's doing anything about it. And guess what? They're kind of like getting into World War II. So, a little important. You already move on? You already did move. I'm not trying to rush you. All right, so this map's really jumping ahead, but something similar is going to happen in Europe. You're going to see Italy and Germany, who are both fascist allies, are going to do a lot of expansion as well. You see some of these parts, such as North Africa, was already controlled by foreign powers. After World War I, France and Britain pretty much divided up North Africa and the Middle East for one another. And then they literally kind of like robbed the resources like oil and stuff like that. Well, Italy and Germany wanted in on some of that as well. Germany is going to expand and start taking parts of Europe, whereas Italy is going to do a little bit of that, but they're mostly going to jump into Africa. You are going to have a fascist government sprout up in Spain, but they're wisely going to stay out of World War II. And in fact, Spain is essentially going to be ruled by a fascist until like 1980 something. So it's just kind of weird. Same as Franco. All right, so global tensions. So these Japanese military officers seized control of Manchuria after a section of Japanese-owned railroad was destroyed. We're not sure who it was destroyed by. It could have been competing European power, could have been by communist terrorists, or it could have been by Chinese patriots who wanted the Japanese out. This attack was launched without the permission of the Japanese government. The League of Nations called for peace but offered no enforcement. So remember, the League of Nations was something created by Woodrow Wilson. But the thing is, it didn't have any teeth. America didn't join it because a lot of Americans were very worried we would lose our national sovereignty. Japanese imperialists saw this as a case for legitimizing Japan's dominance over all of Asia. They're like, it's easy, nobody's going to do anything about it, why don't we take it? In Europe, Germany and Italy had similar aspirations in both hyper-nationalism and expansionism. So they believe not only is their country the only civilization that's really worth having, it's so superior to all other civilizations, they might as well take over the known world just like the ancient Romans did. In 1933, Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany, promising to improve its shattered economy and through reestablishing it as a world power. So of course, like Adolf Hitler, right? He's born in a German-speaking country called Austria. He's a failed artist. Whenever he made his portfolio to go to world-famous art school, they rejected it. And so he moved to Germany, and he started selling little bitty portraits and cartoons on the side of the street. Eventually, he heard of a new political party that was coming up, promising to answer Germany's problems, and that was the Nazis. And so eventually he's going to take control of the Nazi party. Remember, he was a World War I veteran too, if you might remember. And after he takes over the party, they commit an act of terrorism. He's going to end up in prison. And when he's in prison for that, he's going to write a book called Mein Kampf, which translates to My Struggle. It's going to be a bestseller in Germany. He's going to get wildly popular and eventually released from prison. He's going to be so popular because he does something called, he goes to these places called beer halls, which every German town and city had, which was a place where the community pretty much went together and they all hung out, right? So he would go and he would give speeches at these places, shake hands, and do kind of like the politician thing. And so people demanded that he had a place in the government. So he was placed second in command of the government, and eventually he took over the entire thing. But just know that Adolf Hitler will become a tyrant, a dictator, but it's going to be through a very democratic process. Democracies tend to lean towards having one person in charge of it. It's a strange phenomenon. Something similar happens in Italy. Benito Mussolini, he was actually a history teacher who joined their fascist party down there. He's going to be known as a very powerful speaker in Italy. And he's going to, when he gives his speeches, a lot of Italians are really going to buy into it. He talks about building up Italy into a new Rome, something that their ancestors had built. So that appealed to a lot of Italians at this time. And when he becomes dictator for life, he's going to, just like Hitler, at first, they're going to do things that seem very benign. They're going to have their countries really invest into like factories, making the roads better, fighting crime, stuff like that. Looks pretty good. But eventually they're going to start not only attacking other countries, but also singling out people who live within their countries and start eradicating. Hitler obviously did so, we know, with the Jews and many other groups of people. So did Mussolini on a smaller scale, people such as the Gypsies. And so it's, like I said, one of the things about a democracy is they tend to appoint a strong person to be in charge of them, even though that sounds very undemocratic. Another thing that democracies tend to do is whenever you have the conglomerate of the whole, it tries to make itself uniform. And whatever's not uniform, it tries to eradicate. And so that's always minority groups. In Italy, it was gypsies. They were mostly from Eastern Europe, Southern Russia. They lived in their own communities, and they tended to not be part of the standard religion there. Well, of course, in Germany, Jewish people tend to live in their own communities. They had their own schools, they had their own synagogues, and they didn't integrate into German communities as deeply as everyone else. And so they were seen as the minority. So we move on. So let's see here. So this is skipping ahead a little bit, but this shows like the Nazi expansion in Germany. After World War I, they were told they couldn't do things like trade with certain nations, build up a big military. They had to be careful what kind of things they could produce. And they had to pay concessions. They had to pay reparation payments that were so crippling they couldn't get out from under it. Hitler's going to get out of all of that, not legally, but because he does it, it's going to help Germany pull out of their depression. And believe it or not, Germany had a worse Great Depression than America. Their rates of starvation were higher. Their money was near worthless. People used to firewood. So a lot of people kind of had a reason why they were looking for somebody to get them out of that. In 1936, Italy had fully annexed Ethiopia, that's in Africa, through invasion and conquest. The world denounced the atrocities committed, such as poisonous gas, but the U.S. denounced it, but stayed neutral due to a growing sense of isolationism, which we talked about earlier. Yeah, in Ethiopia, it was an unprovoked invasion. Italians used tanks, poison gas, machine guns on a very under-equipped Ethiopian army. And whenever there, they essentially just pillaged the land, natural resources, whenever they wanted. So this was something that by now European nations were starting to frown against. Later that year, Germany violated the Treaty of Versailles by occupying the Rhine. So you see, that's essentially this land here. So they start moving closer to France. In Spain, the Spanish Civil War began in order to install a fascist government with the aid of Nazi advice and air power. So the Spanish Civil War was essentially between a fascist government led by a man named Franco versus underground communists. Hitler favored fascist. He helped out Mussolini in the past, and now he was going to help out with Franco. And so he sent advisors, and he sent his air force, the Luftwaffe, down to this Spanish Civil War. Not only did they help Franco win, but his troops learned a lot about warfare, and they got a lot of experience that would make the Nazis very, very scary and powerful during the first part of the war. FDR, that's Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and much of the nation refused to recognize the war between China and Japan that was going on too. And they continued to trade with both nations unrestricted. That's the thing we have American tradition with. I mean, we did it all the way back when America was first founded. It's what got us in the War of 1812. We were trading with both France and Britain. And they both told us to stop, but we both kept trading with both, trying to stay neutral. But eventually we got sucked into that war. On December the 12th, 1935, Japanese aircraft sank an American gunboat called the Panay. So we're already starting to see American casualties. Americans denounced this, but it wasn't quite enough to tip us over into warfare yet. Yeah, that's going to wait till Pearl Harbor. So remember, we want to focus on the Great Depression at home. We don't want to go to war. People are upset. They're like, we got to fix home. Can't go abroad. And there's a lot of veterans from World War I who just remembered how terrible that war was. And they didn't want to go off and start dying in another foreign war. It's just, I'm sure you understand the sentiment, but I don't think, of course, nobody has crystal balls and they don't know how quite bad things are going to get.
If Hitler took over the Nazi Party, where did they come from? In the first place?
Well, all right, so Germany before this time, especially before World War One, was like the leading academic center of the world, and there was this big philosophical movement that came out of Germany called the Hegelian movement, and Hegel inspired was the teacher for people like Karl Marx, and Hegelians split into two camps. You either split to the camp where the ideology was communism, like Karl Marx, or it was socialism built on nationalism. And so they didn't have figureheads for the National Socialist movements, but the communists did. And so a lot of Germans they blamed some of the problems that they were facing was like the failure of capitalism is what they called it. So they thought the Depression was also part by that. And so you had two socialist groups kind of running. You had communist, which would be around when the Nazis took over. That's who Antifa was. Antifa was the communist movement in Russia. They made a political party, anti-fascist. And then you had the Nazi Party, which essentially these nationalist socialists, they believe that, and one of the differences is like with communism, it's about no such thing as private property and stuff like that, right? But it's about having a worldwide one government while the world gets together for this utopian society. Whereas National Socialists, they don't believe in a worldwide peaceful society. They believe in their nation being the greatest, but everything serves the nation, kind of like the ancient Spartans. It's like there's factories. Well, those factories are to help the nation, not the world, the nation.
But I thought Hitler announced socialism. So
No, he denounced Marxism. He was a socialist. See, the thing is, Nazi socialism worked like this. You got to own your factory and reap a profit, but you had to do everything you were told. So the government would run all the factories and things like that and have a high tax rate off of it, high enough to where they essentially owned it. But they, like Hitler called, like that was one of Hitler's biggest criticisms of Stalin and Lenin, was that when Stalin and Lenin took over Russia, they killed off all the factory owners, the academics, the experts, and they're like, we'll just train people to take over one day. That led to a lot of starvation. What Hitler did was he just took over all of the property but kept it in place and charged them. It's like, hey, guess what? Volkswagen, the Nazis now own your factory, but we're going to let you stay there, be the owner and the managers for it. But you got to build what we tell you to, such as bombs and stuff like that. Okay, so that's kind of how it worked. It was essentially, think about like military control over everything. That's what like Nazi socialism was like. It was the same for like Mussolini and Hitler. So small private businesses could be had, but the major businesses the government took over.
So Marxism would have led to anti-fascism and the different ranges of fascism. So it's like eventually anti-fascist to fascist.
Well, they were split apart. The only reason they called themselves anti-fascists because they were an opposition group. Since the Nazis were in power and they were fascists, they said, "Well, fine, we're anti-fascist." They didn't want to call themselves communists because they had a bad rap because of the Russians. Nobody wanted to call themselves that, but they were Marxists. They had one thing in common economically. They were all about socialism. They were about government control of property, government control of industry. But one was outwardly for like this nationalist ideology, and one was more for the idea of, because like on paper, Marxism works out to where individuals have their own rights and the government is supposed to make sure that all rights and property is spread out equally and it controls it. And eventually, you start doing things like you start even getting rid of nations and things like that. And eventually, there's just the world, and the world is organized in a way where everyone's able to work within certain systems to provide for one another. They don't own things; they just share things all throughout the world. Essentially, like that's like the utopian idea. But the thing is, whenever it's tried, you have a dictator or a bureaucracy take over, and they keep everything for themselves.
Because it relies on the government.
Yeah, they do, and you also have underground markets come up anyways, and so it into an apparatus where we just help one another out all the time, just because people do that, and that's called charity. But charity is when you give up some of your property for someone else for a higher purpose. Marxism is where you give up all of your stuff because you're told to do so, and then you will be provided with what you need. Nationalism is kind of like the same thing. You give up whatever we tell you to give up because it's for the greater good of your country. Does that make sense? Yeah, a little bit. But, all right, we're going to do that last slide for the day. All right, so you had the rise of Nazism, and the world's getting scared of what's happening. They're afraid that all this expansionism is going to lead to another war. And so you have this guy. This guy's going to be the Prime Minister of England during this time. And he's famously going to go meet Hitler and come back to England and say, you don't have anything to worry about. He told me he's going to be an all right guy, and I believe him. And he was wrong. So, all right, so by 1938, Hitler announced that he intended to unify all German-speaking people to Germany and create a new empire, a Reich. They called it the Third Reich. The First Reich was the Roman Empire. The Second Reich being, or was it? I think the First Reich was Charlemagne. The Second Reich, I think, was the Roman Empire. The Third Reich is the Nazis, I think. So he went on to annex Austria, and then he took the Sudeten region of Czechoslovakia. So what I'm saying here is he went south, and then he took lands to the east as well. So this was a common thing back then. Even back during Tsarist Russia, they were trying to unify Slavic-speaking people. It's people who speak languages like Russian. Yeah. Can I wait just a few minutes? Sure. Okay. So, so this is the idea about it's racial stuff, right? He's like, hey, if you speak German, you're part of my race, and I want you to be part of my great big country that's going to be better than any other country. So he's trying to bring them into that. And there's a lot of countries near Germany where you have large German-speaking populations, such as Eastern France, southern part of Poland. So he wants to take out these areas and make them part of Germany at first. Then he's going to get greedy and want more. The Czechs had a defensive pact with France and the Soviet Union. Neither government wanted to get involved. They're like, well, those guys are scary. Things are back home. Don't want a war. Britain's prime minister, the guy we saw a picture of, Neville Chamberlain, then had a famous meeting with Adolf Hitler in Munich. He especially wanted to avoid war and kept telling his countrymen that everything was okay. Their Secretary of Navy, I think it was Secretary of Navy at the time, Winston Churchill, would show evidence that the Nazis were making massive amounts of weapons, that they were mobilizing troops, getting them ready for war. But Chamberlain didn't want to hear it. Hitler told Chamberlain that he would not seek any more land or territory. In return, Chamberlain accepted Germans' rights to take the lands they invaded. It's like, hey, you took over that land, you invaded it with your military, you can keep it. Just please don't hurt us. Chamberlain returned to England and proclaimed peace in our time. So he was like, hey, don't worry, buddy. There's not going to be a war, but we know he's wrong. And hey, that's going to end our lecture for today. We're going to come back on Tuesday and Friday. But on a Friday, I'm not going to lecture. We're just going to have our quiz, okay? So, see you later.
What happened to that tree?
A tree.
What tree?
Doesn't it split in half? Oh my